All right, and it looks like we are live. Hello, everyone. This is My Two Cents, and thanks for checking out my channel this evening. Doing something rather unique in that I am hosting a debate as opposed to participating. The topic of this debate is anarchism versus minarchism. Can a state exist in a libertarian society? Debating in the affirmative will be the dark conservatarian and rational outlaw. Debating in the negative will be esoteric the free and filthy heretic. Before we get started, though, I'm going to give each of them an opportunity to introduce themselves. So starting on the affirmative side, DarkCon and Rational Outlaw, go ahead and introduce yourselves.
Hello, everybody. You know me already. Dark Conservatarian, often guest on My Two Senses channel, on live streams, and mostly on mirror videos and so on and so forth. And yes, I am going to be arguing in the positive and teaming up with Rational Outlaw in arguing the positive.
And for those who, And for those who, most of you probably do not know me, or maybe some of you do, depending. My name is Rational Outlaw. I'm also arguing in the affirmative of Minarchism. And, well, my beliefs are based on mostly, I like to base my views on rationality, the philosophy of being rational.
Okay, Filthy and Eso.
Oh, hi, I'm the Heretic. I'm going to be arguing in the negative that the state and the government has no basis in existing in a libertarian society, and the argument I'm going to be using is going to be based on natural law.
Hey everyone, I'm Eso. I'm going to be arguing in the negative. Yeah, most of you probably know who I am, so I don't need to explain my beliefs necessarily. But yes, I think there are various philosophical problems with the concept of political rule itself. And yes, I'm going to be attempting to explain why there is no continuity between minarchy and the philosophy of libertarianism.
All right, thank you guys. And Pumpkin Row, thank you for the super chat. Please ask positions on the nuking of Japan in World War II. Nate, the volunteerist, who is the chat moderator, please make note of that, and we will. That'll be the first question when we get to the audience questions near the end. As everyone who watches my channel knows, I am an anarchist, but again, I am not taking part in this debate. I am simply the moderator, so it's my job to make sure that both sides stay within the predetermined, agreed format for this debate, which I'm going to go over briefly. So how this is going to go is each side will be given an opportunity for a 15-minute opening statement, affirmative going first, negative second. After that, each side will be given 10 minutes for cross-examination. So in other words, one at a time, each side will be allowed to ask the other side questions about their opening statement. The purpose of the cross-examination is not to rebut or actually engage any of the points made, but merely ask questions for clarification. And for each of these, the time limits, the entirety does not all have to be used. You can forfeit the rest of your time if you wish, but when the time runs out, I will move on. Following that, each side will be given a 10-minute uninterrupted rebuttal. And then after that, we are going to move into open dialogue between both sides. And then at the end, we will take questions in the chat. So getting started, affirmative side, so Dark Conservatarian and Rational Outlaw will be allowed to make their 15-minute opening statement to defend why they think the existence of a state is consistent with a libertarian society. Give me a second to get my timer going here. All right, DarkCon and Rational Outlaw, you have 15 minutes to make your opening statement, beginning now.
All right, we agreed that I would go first. So originally I was going to make a video talking about, explaining as to why I am not an anarchist myself, but here we are. So anarchism, or anarcho capitalism to be more specific, I believe is a moral ideal. As even though I don't fully embrace it, I sympathize, however, with the talking point of taxation as theft. And don't misconstrue with what I'm trying to say. When I say it's a moral ideal, I don't mean to imply that anyone thinks that once Ancapistan becomes a thing, that it will be perfect utopia or anything like that. Just to clear that up. But all this said, I don't find anarchism attainable, much less sustainable for the long run. If the US government were to completely collapse within the next few years, let's say, there will be complete bloody chaos. Mobs or Mobs of Antifa, roaming around to attempt to secure their own communist version of paradise, riots of welfare whores, pillaging stores and wherever else they can get their life essentials instead of immediately becoming self-sustaining individuals, multiple other groups looking to run amok, enforcing their own social order on the weak and unarmed just because reasons, and even possibly neighboring countries that'll look to conquer pieces of unprotected land and citizenry who are not well prepared enough for the impending threat. But of course, there will be the pockets of Ancaps and other types of libertarians who will be self-sustaining, self-defending, peaceful people. But outside of those types of groups, there will still be massive death with the fall of the U.S. Because of that alone, I myself am in no ways advocating, much less giddy, of the immediate destruction of the U.S. as it stands today at large. But say the time comes that we in the U.S. come to a complete collapse, but say the time comes that we in the U.S. come to a post-collapse, post-revolution, relatively stable time in anarchy, or instead of the complete destructive, violent collapse of the U.S., we peacefully fade away all government in the U.S. region of the world and peacefully transition to anarchy or Ancapistan. Say either one of those happen to get us to a more stable time in anarchy. I will still say that it'll just end up back in square one in some cases in the goal of trying to abolish all government in the U.S. There will either be people who won't give two shits about the NAP and other people's rights and will end up having mob rule, or like all the Me Too feminists carrying out their own vigilante justice, quote unquote, on whomever gets flagrantly accused of rape, for example. Due process just goes out the window. Or the innocent can form their own private court or security, as some people will try and theorize, or possibly both private court and security for the sake of the protection and due process of the innocent. But so can the Me Too feminists can do that as well for carrying out their own version of justice, quote unquote, among other examples of other ideologies. You'll have this court fighting that court over what is to be done with their own clients. The Me Too court will be all like, hey, your client raped this lady so many years ago, and we want to bring him to justice. MRA court will be all like, no, we have to give him his due process first. What's the evidence that he's really guilty other than a vague accusation? And so they'll splinter off into their own regions with their clients living, by them, I mean the courts. So the courts will splinter off into their own regions with their clients living close to their vicinity or in their jurisdiction to make things easier to guarantee their due process or lack of and protection of their rights, or rather what they view to be their rights. To be living inside the land that these said private courts have jurisdiction over, or in the land that they might just outright own, and if the court clients are paying an often fee or else get kicked off the land or even put in jail, seems like in that example that everyone living in said land is back at square one and essentially living in what can be called a proto-state. And if anyone says that they don't really have to live within the land that the private court has jurisdiction over for the private court to give them their services and whatnot, well, I don't see how that's really possible with multiple courts and or mobs in conflict with one another on what is justice. For how though Minarchism, or minimalist government rather, is consistent with libertarianism, I'd like to simply say that with all the definitions that I've ever found on libertarianism, none of them are absolutely government exclusive, but neither is libertarianism inclusive of government in its definition. It leaves that part of the definition open, I will say, and I yield to Rash.
Okay, like Darkhan, I believe the idea of anarcho capitalism sounds like a moral idea. However, I don't think it is realistic to human nature. I believe there will always be a group of people who wish to gain power, whether it be through force or through tricking people, and that group can be a government, like another government, an organization or a corporation, or even a religion. We already see this in many different examples with certain corporations doing very illegal or immoral activity, or certain religions doing very atrocious things like Islam. My other point is, even if you were able to attain an Ancap society, I don't think it would last very long. I believe you can slow down or prevent those kinds of groups any authoritarian groups from gaining power. However, I don't think you can stop them. I think you only can slow them down or prevent them. And my point is, no form of style of government, whether it be a lack of government or a minarchist government, no form of government is going to last forever. It obviously is going to eventually collapse. Nothing lasts forever. My main point is that all you can do is slow down or prevent. And that's why I believe a minarchist form of government, depending on which kind you have, can slow it down. That's my whole point, is to keep as much liberty for as long as you can.
Okay, you still have 8 minutes and 20 seconds left. Do you wish to cede the rest of that time?
I believe I'm done with my points, my main points. What about you, Dark Khan?
Yeah, I don't have much more to add, although I do want to say, if anyone goes wondering or anything like that, yes, I did get myself a few bullet points and words written down to help keep my train of thought going. But yeah.
Okay, with the consent of both Dark Khan and Rational Outlaw, they will be ceding their remaining 8 minutes. At this point, we'll move to Eso and Filthy Heretic. You also have 15 minutes to make your opening statement. You can go ahead and unmute your mics. Dark Khan and Rational Outlaw, please keep your mics muted during this time. Filthy and Eso, your 15 minutes for opening statement begins now.
Yeah, now likewise, between me and Eso, we agreed that I would go first. So anyways, in order to figure out what a libertarian society, whether or not it would have a state, we need to know what libertarianism is. Libertarianism, briefly, is opposition to unjust authority, relying on the distinction between just and unjust. What is just, being what actions one can take that does not violate natural law. Anything that violates natural law, or to put it more concretely, but by no means interchangeably, anything that violates the self-ownership of the individual is an unjust action. This is how we know that, for example, theft is wrong, which is the taking of property without consent, or how rape is wrong, since it's the taking of sexuality without consent. Nothing of what I said should be controversial among libertarians, least of all among us. Theft is unjust, whether we call it burglary by a thief or gun confiscation by a police officer. Murder is unjust, whether it's a stabbing or an abortion. The labels describe different circumstances, but the action remains the same. Individuals that do these things are acting unjustly, and anyone who engages in unjust action is a criminal. Any individual who claims they can act unjustly without being a criminal cannot do so without appealing to a logical fallacy. Any organization that claims that its members can commit criminal acts is a criminal organization and cannot justify their claim without appealing to logical fallacies. This is how we know government actions are unjust. They legislate, creating rules and restrictions that we must follow. Failure to do so means that they will escalate force against us until we either comply or die, and that's only when we're lucky enough for when compliance is enough. They send indoctrinated young people who can't think or act as otherwise their schoolmasters would have wished to be traumatized, maimed, or killed in foreign wars of aggression against peaceful nations. They take our property without our consent and call it taxation. When they cannot use that alone to fund our victimization, they inflate the currency, hurting our spending power. Otherwise, they use our property against our consent once again as collateral against which to borrow more money from foreign banks. Once the debt is called, they can just tax the money, taking our property they need to make those payments. If one dislikes the actions another is taking, well, they should be able to refuse to fund it. We cannot do this with the government. If occupational licenses, minimum wage, foreign wars of aggression, abortion, capital punishment, the drug war, the surveillance state, victimless crimes, corporate welfare, bailouts, subsidized housing, government schooling, military conscription, and more are not meeting our marginal interests, we can't simply choose not to have our stolen taxpayer dollars go to fund it, or even any of it at all. We are forced to associate with this criminal organization, this coercive monopoly called a government, which engages in all of the acts libertarians should recognize as unjust. Theft, such as through taxation, kidnapping, such as through jailing, murder, such as through war, and now that the South Korean government has mandatory girlfriends, and no, I am not kidding, we can include rape as well. What is the government except a criminal organization? Were a U.S. citizen to act in the ways the U.S. government acts, they would be arrested and the government would be applauded for doing so. Now, one might avoid having the government engaging in criminal behavior by restricting the government to a clearly delineated set of responsibilities. This still does not quite get around the problem, because the government, by its very nature, requires theft to fund itself. If it didn't, then government wouldn't be necessary to have those services, wouldn't it? Since people would fund them voluntarily. Now, some will try to have it both ways. A voluntarily funded government, for example, surely is compliant with natural law, but if people are free to or to not fund a government, then they must also be free to disassociate with the government, else it is still a criminal organization. Similarly, others must be free to compete against the government, else it is still a criminal organization. Such a government, it is argued, will be just, since people can choose to or to not fund it, can become entrepreneurs to compete against it, and the government is thus incentivized to provide goods and services that people actually want for a reasonable price. Naturally, people will not pay for their own victimization as well. So if this is the case, that the minarchist argument in favor of the existence of a government that does not tax, does not restrict competition against its own services within its borders, does not force people to associate, does not legislate, or restrict others in any way, well, why even call it a government? Being a libertarian means consistently applying natural law to recognize what is just and unjust, and opposing that which is unjust. Any libertarian society must oppose any unjust criminal or criminal organization and must therefore be incompatible with having an unjust criminal organization ruling over them. All libertarians who take the principles of libertarianism to their logical conclusion can only ever arrive at anarchism. To do so otherwise means to either be inconsistent in one's own principles or to place government above reason, logic, and natural law. The former is simply a lack of understanding, while for the latter, well, if one places the government above logic and reason, is one even a libertarian?
So is it my turn to go now?
Yes.
Okay. So I just want to say, to start off with my introduction, that I saw a lot of conversation going on before the stream, mostly in screenshots from my server and other servers, about playing with the definition of words and getting into semantic arguments in order to try and obfuscate and avoid having a meaningful exchange about the philosophical underpinnings which make up these sort of concepts we're going to be debating tonight, and in its relation to political rule and libertarianism. And I just want to say right off the bat that if this is what we're going to be doing, then I'm not really interested in that kind of argumentation, even remotely. So after we're done with the introductions, if we'd like to start by maybe defining our terms and going from there, if you guys object to how we approach certain ideals, then that's more than okay with me. In fact, I think regardless of your intentions, that's probably going to end up being a major point of contention, which we're going to have to address anyway. And I think it would be helpful to get that out of the way, since most libertarian arguments don't even really address that to begin with. Anyway, so Filthy, I think, summed up pretty well, I think, the reason why political rule is illegitimate in general. But something which I don't think he expanded upon as well as he could have is why libertarianism necessarily has to come to this conclusion of rejecting all political rule. And this is because, as a philosophy, libertarianism's first principles are founded upon a simple observation. Moral agency exists, and every individual person has moral agency. And these are relatively uncontroversial observations, even outside of libertarianism. I mean, the fact that you're sitting down here talking shows an extent of that you are an agent. But therefore, as a consequence of this simple observation, an unavoidable conclusion has been realized, which is that every single person has a right to expressions of their own agency, such as exclusive ownership of the resources that they create or harvest, freedom of speech, freedom of association, etc. Because the only alternative would require a basic violation of the axiom of consistency or the law of non-contradiction. This being the assertion that it's possible a moral agent could justify expressing dominion over another moral agent, since there's no tangible characteristic one could ever point to which would justify such a position. Any premise asserting this at most can only ever rely on special pleading. And this is necessarily the thing which makes coercion in general unjustified. So to an extent, every approach to philosophy sort of concedes this point. So it's not presuppositional or a no true Scotsman argument to say that libertarianism has to be a rejection of all political rule, because as a necessary characteristic of its own foundational premise as a philosophy, its own truth claim, it stands as a refutation in and of itself against the legitimacy of such a declaration of power. Now, that explains why there's no continuity between minarchism and libertarianism, sure. But I think as a concept in general, minarchism is flawed. For one thing, it assumes that, as I've pointed out previously, but some people may not have seen my recent videos, but for one thing, in order for there to be a coherent minarchist argument, you're making an individual assessment of a firm and its association with other actors. And the problem is that in order for character judgments or assessments of morality around the idea of how small a government is relative to other governments, you have to compare it to another government. And there is no tangible reason we can point to which would explain how that's logically consistent. And also, that would mean that if there were no other governments, that it would be impossible for a government to be evaluated on its ethical legitimacy. So that's one reason why I think minarchism is flawed. Another reason why, another big part of the problem that I see with minarchism is that it kind of assumes that the decisions of states are based around ideology, or that there are no sort of incentives or material factors motivating the actions of governments and how governments expand and contract themselves according to sort of the realities of the world around them. And I think that's seriously flawed, and it's kind of just obviously wrong. I mean, major metropolitan centers, for example, are going to have more expansive states regardless of the stated position of the politicians that are ruling over the local city governments there, because there is simply more that the state has to actually use in order to exert its influence over that city, since there's more going on because there's more people and more trade there. Another problem that this makes is that it kind of it assumes that a small government domestically, or a government retracting domestically, is not expanding elsewhere, and historically governments which don't exert a large degree of influence over the domestic population of their sort of nation which they claim to rule over are actually expanding by engaging in military aggression elsewhere in the world. And the United States itself for most of history has been a good example of this. The British Empire also, to an extent, was a decent example of this. Historically, tax rates were always really low in homeland Britain, but yeah, the British economy was obviously imperialistic.
You have 1 minute remaining.
Okay, and the last thing that I was going to say is that I don't think for this reason that there is necessarily such a thing as an authoritarian ideology, because authoritarian principles aren't really coherent. They operate entirely around presuppositions, and therefore they're nothing more really than a statement of preference. And this being the case, I think that even what is a political action or a political leaning itself is up for debate. But okay, I'm finished with what I had to say. My introduction.
Okay, you cede your remaining 10 seconds. All right, at this point, we're going to move on to each side will be given a 10-minute cross-examination. So, SO, as to your point about clarifying definitions, if, for example, you want to ask the other side how they define a certain term, you may do that during this cross-examination. If you want to ask about something specifically that was said during the opening statement, you can do that. But again, cross-examination, the point is the positive side, it will go positive, then negative as before. So DarkCon and Rational Outlaw, you will have 10 minutes to ask Filthy and SO whatever questions you may have about their position. Again, this is not to rebut any points that have been made, but simply for clarification. Following that, Filthy and SO, you will have 10 minutes to ask DarkCon and Rational Outlaw. So everyone is okay to go ahead and unmute their mics. DarkCon, Rational Outlaw, you have 10 minutes to cross-examine Filthy and SO. Your 10 minutes begin now.
Did you want to start?
Did you say, okay. So I do want to say that I agree that I overall don't want to debate semantics, but still for the sake of argument, what would you guys exactly define as libertarianism, and what by what dictionary would you be going off for that definition?
I define libertarianism as opposition to unjust authority.
And I already explained what the sort of axiomatic underpinnings of that position are and why necessarily they have to be those specific underpinnings.
But by what source would that be?
You're asking for a citation to an axiomatic truth claim?
Pretty much for a definition on libertarianism.
I don't think you understand how that works.
Citing a dictionary definition?
You're not going to find axiomatic principles in a dictionary.
I mean, I can cite to you people early on explaining like sort of the underpinnings of how this came to be, such as William Belsham in his essay on liberty and necessity in 1789, explaining that libertarianism is a position which asserts exactly what I claimed that it did, but in the context of a discussion of free will versus determinism. But the fact whether or not someone was first to say it is kind of irrelevant, or who said it first in what context is irrelevant, because this idea that, oh, we have to look at a dictionary or an encyclopedia to explain what libertarianism is. It's a tautological argument, because
if I may slow you down for a second there.
Okay.
I mean, I'm not looking for like who cited or who created the definition of libertarianism first or whatever else have you. I mean, words evolve, obviously, but I guess essentially to kind of narrow down your answer, would it be that you don't have a dictionary definition, that you're just
well, I just
using...
cited one from
What was that
William
again?
I just cited one from William Belsham, but what I was trying to get to is saying "my dictionary" in response to explaining why logically something has to be a certain way in order to justify the axioms that it's proclaiming. That doesn't really work. That's an entirely presuppositional argument. You're not providing me or anyone else a reason for why your negation of that is true. You're just saying, well, this is what someone else says that it ought to be.
Seems to be roughly the way that you're being
It's
as well.
It's a lot.
Saying that this is how that we ought to judge libertarianism and its definition.
I guess I'll give you something to compare it to. You're familiar with when Marxists tend to reply to criticisms of their idea for how to achieve communism with, oh, the dictionary says that communism is a stateless, classless society, therefore all of these sort of problems that are innate to it don't exist. That's presuppositional argumentation, and that's exactly what you're doing right now.
Well, the definition of socialism, Marxism, has kind of evolved slightly over the years since Marx has died.
It kind of doesn't matter, and it also thing. I mean, if we really get back to it, socialism meant something entirely different before Marx came along, but that's not really related to the discussion. My point is that citing the dictionary is not an argument.
I'd say it would be relevant to the discussion, but if
you're not addressing the sort of problems that we've brought up, such as how.
Okay, I'm pausing the clock for a minute. I'm pausing the clock for a minute. You can continue this discussion if you wish, but Dark Khan, I would remind, and Rational Outlaw, I would remind you, this is your time to cross-examine Filthy and Eso. So if at any point you don't like where the conversation is going, you can choose to cut it off and move on to another question. If you want to use that time to let this discussion play out as it is, you may. I would just again point out that the rebuttals will come later. This was the primary purpose of cross-examination, is for you and Rational Outlaw to get answers to the questions you have. So
I think I'm going to just yield the rest of my time to Rational Outlaw then.
Okay, the clock is running again. You have 5 minutes left.
Okay. How would you define Minarchism to believe? How do you view it as?
Which one of us are you asking?
Let's go with Filthy.
Minarchism is the philosophy of attempting to have a government with as few responsibilities and as few powers as possible.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
And what does having government schools and drug wars and bailouts have to do with Minarchism? Doesn't that have to do with more of like other forms of governments where they're more republics or a more controlling governments?
Well, that's the actual problem, isn't it? You're going to have individual minarchists who are going to argue that certain powers and responsibilities are the perfectly legitimate functions of a government. You have, for example, a whole lot of conservatives nowadays, mainstream conservatives, who claim themselves to be small government, limited government, will use this exact same rhetoric, and yet they'll say that it's the government's responsibility to ban porn. So ultimately, like the definition I gave is fairly abstract and oblique, but that's kind of the reason that I use it. That it can be used, that any political position that is argued to be the responsibility of a government is ultimately going to fit into the minarchist definition.
And this is exactly sort of what I was driving at earlier when I was pointing out the fact that minarchism is dependent on another government to exist. If you have, it's an entirely arbitrary measurement for ethics, because if you had two governments, one with a 90% tax rate and a 91% income tax rate, we'll say they're both income taxes, then the small government's the one with the 90% income tax, and that would be more ethical according to minarchism. And I think that's rather disassociated from reality.
Well,
Did you have something, Darkon?
yeah, I guess you had no more questions, Rash?
I think that's all my questions I have for now.
Well, I guess just to clarify with Eso, would you say that the real definition, or would you say that the original definition of libertarianism was essentially a synonymous definition with anarchism?
Yes, that's exactly what I would say. In fact, it wasn't until about 1950 that this idea that minarchy could be about shrinking government or could be small government came into the picture.
Do you think then that the definitions of marriage, gay, and queer should go back to their original definitions?
That's not really comparable.
What do you mean it's not really comparable?
Well, I just explained earlier that libertarianism, my reason for saying libertarianism has to necessarily be a rejection of political rule is based upon how libertarians come to that conclusion and
I don't see
philosophical underpinnings of libertarianism. And
I don't see how it has to be that way if by definition it's not necessarily that.
There's nothing necessarily about marriage, people getting together and forming a relationship with one another that necessitates it being a man and a woman, or the other
nowadays, anyways.
You mentioned.
No,
there never has been. But as I've pointed out with libertarianism, in order to come.
Okay, I'm pausing the clock quick. You guys have 30 seconds left. So do you want to let this continue, or did you have
one last question? I have one last question.
I guess I'll let Rational Outlaw respond.
My last question is for Filthy. Is how would you be able to maintain an anarcho-capitalist society or a right-wing anarchist society?
Why would I want to maintain a right-wing society? A right-wing anarchist society?
I'm talking about your anarchist society, Ancapistan, whatever you want to call it. How would you maintain it?
Instead of it being some ANCOM type thing.
Well, why would I need to maintain it?
Okay, I'm going to cut it off there. The time is up, and that last question wasn't really a point of clarification. It was more of a challenge to the position. So,
sorry about that.
All right,
something that I was planning on going over in our rebuttal anyway. But Filthy, do you want to start?
All right, hang on. Give me a chance to reset the clock. All right, SO and Filthy, you have 10 minutes for cross-examination. Again, like everyone remember, this is not about debating at this point, but merely clarifying what position, the position of your opposition. So your 10 minutes for cross-examination begin now.
SO, you want to start?
Well, I assumed that you might want to, but I mean, I guess that I could start. So this sort of problem being proposed of how do you maintain an anarchy or an anarchist social order, I think is not very well conceived of foundationally. And that's because it assumes that natural law or the ethical observations which would maintain a stateless order are normative or prescriptive. That being the assumption that everybody sort of would have these moral conceptions, the same moral conception as one another, or that just for some reason every court would be exactly the same. And that is not the truth claim being proposed by natural law proponents. The natural law in how natural law proponents describe it is descriptive.
Sorry, but was there a question here?
Well, I'm responding to what Rational Outlaw mentioned in the introduction and also in his rebuttal, which didn't really get addressed quite clearly.
Okay, I'm pausing the clock. So you can do that, and I think the point Darkon's trying to make is that you can do as soon as the cross examination is over, we're going to go on to rebuttals. So you can start.
Okay.
So at this point, do you have any questions for Darkon or Rational Outlaw regarding clarifying what their position is? Something that was made in their opening statement.
How exactly do you maintain a consistent, cohesive legal order in a society where legal order is determined by force?
I would say that it was set up about almost about 250 years ago in the United States, but of course it had deteriorated, and I will say that governments will always deteriorate, even if they are set up with so many mechanisms to prevent itself from getting bigger, be a constitution or multiple branches of governments that are able to keep each other in check. Either one, or an electoral college, even, for example. Even if you have so many checks and balances like that, it will always deteriorate in all eventuality. But I would kind of say that anarchism would fall under the same thing.
I have to agree with Darkon there, if I could also further clarify. I also believe that it would further, that anarchism itself would also deteriorate over time, perhaps I believe even quicker than that of many other forms of governments. I believe it would fall under a tyrannical form of government or group far more rapidly than a more minarchist form of government, depending on, though, specifically what kind of minarchist government, because there are certain kinds that would fall into tyranny far faster than others.
Well, you just negated your entire premise. If governments are bound to expand and deteriorate, then how can you argue for the state on the pragmatic grounds you proposed against anarchy?
The whole point is to maximize liberty as much as possible and for as long as possible. That's our whole argument.
You're not. That's not a free society, though, because you have a monopoly on arbitration, which is imposing its will on the people, socially engineering
is that a question?
Force. I guess that is a question. How can you say that you're maintaining liberty when your society that you're attempting to defend is authoritarian and coercive by its nature?
Would you like to take this, Darkon, or should I?
Authoritarian and coercive by its nature. I mean, if you're going to say like even the smallest thing, like a flat 10 or even 5% tax rate, and they're using all those funds to fund courts and to keep people's due process going, and a police force that, by the way, does not confiscate people's anything, but is meant to help enforce to make sure that people actually arrive in court if they commit a crime. By the way, when I say crime, I'm talking about murder, rape, and stuff that is objective like that. If you're gonna call even the smallest thing like that authoritarian and coercive as compared to something like North Korea, well then I can't really help with that. I would just disagree that it is not authoritarian in the grand scheme of things.
But you just admitted that governments by their nature cannot maintain something like that.
Yes, but can I
even ignore?
We could maintain it for at least the short term or even the long term of things. I just said that eventually it is going to deteriorate.
Our whole
But you
point
can't
is that
argue for the state on those grounds, even under the standards you established.
actually we can. We're establishing it under maximizing the amount of freedom for as long as possible. What we believe is anarchism will more than likely deteriorate in a far faster rate.
But
We're not saying that we're not arguing for minarchism or small government because it'll never deteriorate or anything like that. We've never said that.
That's not what I'm saying. You're arguing for the state around that exact standard. We're trying to maximize freedom for as long as possible. But even as you established, you can make fundamentally the exact same argument about the state that you attempted to make about anarchy. You just said
our whole point is anarchism would deteriorate far faster. There's nothing stopping it from
even according to your own standard, this gets into something.
Okay, I'm going to cut in here. I think the point has been made. So you may respond to what you see as a flaw in their answer in your rebuttal, but the question's been asked and they've given their answer.
Okay.
All right. So I got a question.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So how do you know exactly? I remember in Dark Khan's initial introduction, he was giving some very specific examples of pragmatic reasons that these systems that would develop in a voluntary society would eventually become corrupt and eventually either devolve into a state or basically result in something that resembles a state. But with this in mind, how do you know exactly what mechanisms the voluntary society will take to will have? Because ultimately, like the main premise of voluntarism is the basis of rational humility, that we don't know specifically how a voluntary society is going to solve the problems of how do we provide apples, how do we adjudicate disputes, and that ultimately, like, this is just going to be a continuous competition of people experimenting with different mechanisms through the marketplace and figuring out what works best and paying for that, as well as new experiments to eventually replace that. So how do you know specifically that the mechanism that you described is going to be what is going to be most prevalent in a voluntary society?
Simply said, I don't. I'm mostly just theorizing, but I would also like to add that this whole debate of minarchism versus anarchy is basically, for the most part, a debate of theories. I mean, for what the future may hold anyways. I mean, in the debate of anarchy, people will argue of what is currently happening with the U.S. government and whatnot. But when we're talking about what could happen under anarchy, it's a debate of theories. And I'm just like offering one plausible theory, just like in the same way that Ancaps will theorize that the roads will be paid for privately in this way, the courts will be paid for and privately that way. We do not need public sector this, that, or the other, because here's how the private sector will handle those aspects of government instead.
Your theory is not plausible, though, because you just fucking explained how it will never happen.
1 minute warning.
What are you meaning?
You just said, okay, so you're claiming that your argument for minarchism is based upon theories and that you think that it is a solid
minarchism?
Yeah, no, your arguments for the idea of minarchism are based
Okay, I'm gonna cut it off there. You can get into that in your rebuttal. SO Filthy, do you have any further questions? You have half a minute.
Yeah, I was trying to ask one. You're claiming that it is a well-formed theory, but you just negated it by mentioning earlier that essentially everything by which you argue for minarchism is not true.
Do you have a question?
No, I was not arguing.
That is a question.
That's not a question. That's a statement.
Well, I want to say
okay, that 10 minutes. 10 minutes are closed. Dark Khan, Rational Outlaw. I'll give you 20 seconds if you want to try and respond.
I just want to say very quickly that I'm not theorizing about minarchism. I was theorizing about anarchism.
You said
what I was saying earlier.
Points are theorizing, though, are based on theories.
I was talking about under anarchism.
Okay, we're going to move into the rebuttal phase at this point. So, Dark Khan, Rational Outlaw, you have 10 minutes to do your rebuttal to SO and Filthy's opening statement. SO, Filthy, please mute your mics at this time. Dark Khan, Rational Outlaw, 10 minutes for your first uninterrupted rebuttal. Begin now.
All right.
Would you like to start?
Sure. I do want to say, first of all, taxation being theft. Like I said earlier, I sympathize with the talking point. I do not know right now if I fully agree with the talking point, but nonetheless, even if I was to grant that it is theft, I would like to see some experimentation regarding of how taxation would be handled for funding courts or anything else like that. But that said, though, I would say that the happenings of taxation happening or taxation happening to fund courts and all that other stuff to protect people from, or at least plausibly protect anyways, people from an angry mob that looks to steal their private property or anything else like that, or keep the mob from taking over a certain region. I find that to be less immoral than say Antifa, for example, taking over a region if anarchism was to happen. And that's just one example. We could bring up many other examples, but I'll save that for later. And I also want to mention very quickly that what Filthy Heretic and plausibly Eso, but definitely Filthy Heretic mentioning about so many things that the government does, we are not necessarily agreeing with or proving that the government is doing those things. The fact that the government is so intrusive when it comes to drugs and sex and all the other stuff like that, thousands of different bureaucracies to control the economy and so forth. And I would like to address very quickly that, I don't know, I think it was kind of implied in the conversation right here that what I said is just essentially assertive, but it was kind of said, if not at least implied anyways, in the live chat by some people, that it's just assertions that I was saying in my opening statement. I would like to add, and by the way, 2 cents, tell me when that 5 minutes is up. But I want to say that it's a very fair assertion, especially taking into consideration the fact that obviously there are so many different disagreeing ideologies here in the United States. Antifa being a very prevalent one that does not respect anybody's private property rights, especially the ones that are more communist and rather mob rule with their communism. And also, I forgot what else I was going to say on that point. And I just want to say very quickly about abortion and the NAP, that there are multiple people, I mean, in extension of talking about different ideologies in the country. There are multiple different opinions regards of abortion. Even with anarchists, there are different views when it comes to abortion. I mean, is it a violation of the non-aggression principle to be taking the abortion, to be getting the abortion, or is it a violation of the non-aggression principle for that abortion to be prevented entirely? Is it a non-aggression on the woman or whatever non-binary genderqueer guy that is bearing the child? There's going to be disagreements on that. And of course, when it comes to violations of the NAP, there are ideas of what you do in regards of that violation of the NAP. Do you respond with force yourself? Like somebody kills you, for example, or somebody commits pedophilia. I'm sure that there will be multiple people who will want to form their own lynch mobs to kill those pedos and so forth. By extension, in regards of abortion, I'm not trying to make any equivocations that abortion in either side is the equivalent of pedophilia when it comes to morality. But the point still stands anyways, that if somebody was to commit abortion, somebody will want to respond. I'm not saying that I would want to respond. Somebody will want to respond, possibly even rather violently, if abortion was to be committed. And then somebody is going to respond to that violent action upon the pregnant mother or formerly pregnant mother or whatever else have you in that case. So who is in the right in that case? And is it the pro-choice side or the pro-life side? Within anarchism, there is going to be massive disagreements on that and possibly even huge turf wars in regards to it.
Okay,
but anyway,
5 minutes remaining.
Yeah, I'll yield the rest of my time to Rash, just in time.
Okay, for continue on a little bit of what Darkhan was saying, there are going to be multiple disagreements. Abortion is one of the biggest things, in which nearly half the country is pro-abortion or pro-choice, whatever you want to call it, or then the other half is pro-life, where they're extremely against abortion. And there's even different kinds of pro-lifers. Some are only around maybe they cut it off like around the second trimester and onward you can't have abortion, but they'll say, okay, the first trimester you can. And then there's people on the pro-life side who are completely against abortion, whether right from conception. And then there's some where in certain weeks in the first trimester. There's different forms on even in those particular fields of arguments, different groups of people. So my point is that there's going to be different disagreements on pretty much everything. Even in, as Darkhan was saying, anarchist societies, there's going to be disagreements on different things, how certain things should be applied, how many times should someone be given the right to a trial, whether it be 2 times, 1 time, as many times as they want. There's going to be disagreements, and you have to be able to settle those things within your society to be able to get anywhere. Otherwise, you're not going to get really anywhere, and you're just going to have groups fighting each other. And, well, you're going to have literal anarchy. And with everyone fighting each other over these different agreements, just in different ideas, different ideologies. My other thing is that the whole point of Minarchism is to, as I said before, maximize the amount of liberty for as long as possible. The whole reason for this is because we realize the human nature of people to disagree, to want to fight each other, or to gain power. All these different groups having different ideas, different values, and everything. It doesn't matter whether there's the non-aggression principle. It doesn't matter whether what is right or what is wrong. People don't care about that. They really don't. They really don't care about that. What they care about is their feelings. They don't care about the facts. They don't care about any facts. They just care about what they believe to be right, not necessarily what is right. That is why I believe a minarchist society would be perhaps the best system we could perhaps have, is because we can maximize the amount of liberty as much as possible, and maximize the amount of time we can have that liberty as much as possible. However, where I believe in anarchist society, where it starts from nothing, I believe a much greater force will try to take up either through force or through force or coercion, or for tricking people into gaining power, and will become far more tyrannical, far faster than a minarchist government would. My other thing I would like to say is schools, wars, and drug wars, things like that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with minarchism. Those are more the conservatives, which I don't think most conservatives consider themselves minarchists. They usually just call themselves minimal government people or small government, which really isn't quite true, I would say personally. And the other thing is, minarchism does exist because although it's kind of somewhat subjective, but it's also somewhat objective. For example, I think most of us here would say the guy who taped a banana to the wall is not art. Most of us would say blatantly outright, that's not art, because
1 minute remaining.
Okay, that's not art. That's the whole point, is that's not art. We would say that's not art. That's just a banana taped to a wall. If anyone could do it, then it's not art. The whole point is certain things are somewhat subjective, but they're also somewhat objective. So I don't think you can say that minarchism doesn't exist in some form. And I believe I've finished all my points.
All right, you're ceding your final 30 seconds then?
Correct.
All right, Dark Con, Rational Outlaw, please mute your mics. Filthy, SO, you can go ahead and unmute yours. SO, Filthy, you now have 10 minutes to make your rebuttal. 10 minutes beginning now.
You want to go first, Filthy?
Yeah. So I kind of might be going a little bit ahead of myself here, but I think it's very interesting the extent to which I make all sorts of natural law arguments against the against the state. And the point that you use to try to rebuke that is to try to appeal to pragmatism, as though you have already conceded the fact that the government itself is immoral and that there is no way to get around this. Ultimately, the only arguments that I'm honestly hearing in favor of a government is that it's absolutely necessary for multiple reasons, including the warlords argument and the Rhodes argument, which have been refuted not just by the both of us, but by other anarchist philosophers numerous times. So I don't think it's really worth getting into that here. With that being said, the point of a minarchist society that ultimately makes it unviable is that you have no way of knowing what a minarchist society looks like, and you have ultimately no control over what form that'll take. As stated earlier, during the rebuttal stage, was it the rebuttal stage? No, this is the rebuttal stage. The cross-examination stage, the government has, or what constitutes a minarchist government is going to vary from person to person. What statement or what justification you have to say that North Korea, for example, is not a minarchist government, you have really no consistent basis to make that argument. Because ultimately they could just say, like, yeah, we're limited because we don't allow landowners to own property. We only allow the government to own property. So it's a limited government. Not to mention that the North Korean constitution is pretty similar to the US's. You've also conceded the fact that a minarchist government is ultimately not going to last. And your only reply to that point is that you think an anarchist society would not be able to last. However, so far, your only mechanism by which to make that point has been to claim features in features in an anarchist society, which you conceded you're not even sure would even be there. How can private courts, for example, become corrupted and achieve a monopoly on arbitration when we're not even sure that private courts would even exist at all? Ultimately, I don't think you really have a consistent basis by which you can make an argument against the voluntarism or any sort of argument in favor of an anarchist society. The real trouble, though, I'm kind of losing my train of thoughts. Freaking hell. Yeah, so you want to
go? Sure. There was a point that I was trying to establish earlier, but something that I've noticed is that the minarchists in this debate haven't really proposed an argument in favor of minarchism. They've just made arguments against anarchy, which that's fine. I'll be going over that here, but I mean, that is pretty telling, and the few things that I have heard that somewhat resemble an argument for the positive are not only entirely presuppositional, but the minarchists here themselves have conceded do not tangibly reflect lived reality in any form whatsoever. Not only that, but they've also conceded that their arguments for against anarchy are not really well founded. They're just based on their own theories of how people organize or how human nature works, which, by the way, those are flawed for several different reasons. The first being the existence of diseconomy of scale, ensuring that there can't be a firm that just buys up all the resources and becomes a state. The other problem that I've noticed mainly with the argument against arbitration, which has been pervasive through their responses, is that this is not really an argument against anarchy, because it's kind of a straw man of our position, as I was trying to explain earlier. This assumes that natural law arguments are based on a normative description of morality or a prescriptive description of morality, but they're actually based on a descriptive explanation of something which can be tangibly observed, axioms and the like. So it's not really, we're not saying, oh, everyone will be moral and no one will commit crimes. What we're actually arguing is that because ethical observations exist, because we can observe them, there is a basis for which a sort of legal order can exist, because one of the sort of foundations which motivates all human action is to achieve a sense of asset stability. So everyone not only would have an incentive to go to an arbitration service or to prioritize arbitration, but the most objective form of arbitration which could possibly exist at any given time would be sort of the incentivized model of people coming along and entering the arbitration market could propose. And that's not, and another thing is you're assuming that they're private courts, well, or that they operate around one payment model, which is more just a general problem with another general problem with your arguments. You're kind of assuming baselessly that in an anarchy there's only one way people would seek to obtain resources, or there are only a fixed number of ways. And there's no real reason to believe that, especially with how much more accessible resources in a stateless society would be. The only reason that even really is the case in the current political economy is because you have all these barriers of entry, all these finance restrictions, and all of these other monopoly state privileges established by the state to establish business cartels and benefit big corpos. So nothing that you've really proposed as a counter argument on pragmatic grounds even really conceptually works. And this becomes even more problematic when you take into consideration the fact that your argument against anarchy is that, okay, there are all these different arbiters with, they could have different standards. Well, the thing with a state society is that in state societies, you have all these irrational people. People are still irrational and they don't apply ethics consistently to their own lives. But the difference is that you have only one arbiter. Everyone is forced to associate and fund it. And they are ultimately not only they're sort of the pillar of society. So they're not only an arbiter that is not objective, is led by emotional, irrational people, but also because of the way that governments are organized and fund themselves, there is actually a structural incentive to antagonize the interests of people who are not associated with the state. Filthy pointed out a couple examples of this in the introduction. The state establishes cartels in the pharmaceutical industry in order.
1 minute warning.
So you mind if I make a closing statement once you're finished?
Yeah, sure. But I was just going to say, I'll list my final thing, which is just the example of pharmaceutical cartels being established by the state in order to expand revenue by manipulating geopolitical events. But yeah,
all right. The closing statement I just want to make in regards to the rebuttal is, well, since the definition of libertarianism is not really in dispute, the question as to whether or not it's compatible with the government really shouldn't be controversial at all. So clearly, the government is not compatible with any libertarian society, and any society with a government cannot be considered libertarian. The most telling, at least to me, is that the overall minarchist argument against anarchism is that anarchism will eventually devolve into minarchy. If that's the case, then my only question is, what have you got to lose?
All right, time has expired. All right, at this point, we've been streaming for an hour and 10 minutes, and we are about to move into the open dialogue portion of the debate. This is the one that has the most potential to get out of hand, so I would, everyone is free to unmute their mics. I would ask that everyone please try to be respectful to one another, allow someone to finish what they're saying before you jump in. I will mute people's mics if I feel it's necessary, but I'm going to try to the best of my ability to allow you guys to talk back and forth and engage the points that you want to. This will go anywhere from 15 to 20 minutes, and then we will move into the questions.
Okay. May I start?
Go ahead.
As to your point about the anarchy possibly turning into a minarchist society, no, that's not exactly the point I was trying to make. My point was that I believe it would go into a very tyrannical form of a government or some government system that would take over, not necessarily a minarchist form. I would think it would be far more likely a more tyrannical form of government would take over an anarchist society. It
could go either way, but on what Filthy last said in his statement right there, that was kind of my point, is that trying to achieve anarchism, that seems to be kind of a moot point, and I guess in regards of my argument for minarchism, that's part of it right there, is that I think that anarchy is a bit of a moot point because it'll come back full circle within probably a short amount of time, with each region appropriate to their circumstances, come back full circle to being under a government. And my argument for minarchism, and I thought it was kind of implied, is that preserving due process and rights and liberties. I thought that was kind of implied in why I believe in minarchism in my opening statement right there, but I guess it wasn't clear enough. And I also want to say that, I did not say that nobody will commit crime. That's also what I said in my opening statement, is that I fully realize that ANCAPs, or anarchists in general, realize that once we get anarchy, that it will not be completely perfect utopia, and that there ultimately will still be people committing moral atrocities like murder, rape, and so forth.
Of course. And I think we can all agree that anarchy is no guarantee that crime will never be committed, but statism in any form is a guarantee that some crime will. But that said, back to the original topic, is libertarianism compatible with a state? That's clearly not being disputed, so I have to assume that you are all conceding that.
No, I was trying to say that I don't think that government or state, rather, as is the term that you use, is inherently contradictory, is not exclusive nor inclusive of the definition of libertarianism. If I may pull up Britannica, political philosophy, that being libertarianism, that takes individual liberty to be the primary political value. And they're explaining in some of this paragraph as well that it's somewhat synonymous with liberalism, the classical definition of liberalism anyways. And the page that I have pulled up, it goes on some other subjects as well. I do not know if you guys want me to link it to you, whatever.
The precursor to the libertarian philosophy were the levelers back in the 17th century. So, I mean, the source that you just cited, I mean, aside from the fact we've already gone over, the Mud Dictionary argument doesn't really address any of the points Filthy and I have raised. That's just that's just objectively wrong.
No, not objectively.
Yeah, because
I thought
yes,
like you said a little bit earlier. Like you said a little bit earlier about trying to address the earlier point, I thought that was what I was trying to get down to, or at least implying, is that I'm not going to like heed your complete and utter denial of the definition of words as described by certain dictionaries.
I'm not denying that you can use the definition of words in a certain context as a description of colloquially how certain phrases or terms are used in discussion. Sure, I mean they can be a benchmark, but for philosophical discussions, citing the dictionary as an explanation of what a word is, it's an entirely presuppositional tautological argument. So that's why I'm rejecting it. I've provided a very cohesive, consistent explanation of why libertarianism necessarily has to be a rejection of all political rule, and your rebuttal of that is that's not what the dictionary says. So
can we please refrain from those kinds of making fun of people?
Yeah, if you want to get aggressive, then I guess we'll rumble. But aside from that, I would like
being aggressive. I'm just
well, you're mocking me, so that kind of implies that. But I do kind of sympathize with Rational Outlaw and want to at least try to keep this civil. I mean, ultimately, I guess my point is just I disagree with your point there. I mean, I don't see of what basis there is for me to come to an objective agreement with you on objective between you and me, at least, anyways. So,
do you have any questions, Filthy?
I mean,
I think I've kind of made my point that the definition of libertarianism that is most consistent with what's put forward by philosophers, as well as its historical.
I was mostly
roots.
If I may just interrupt really quickly, I was mostly talking about if you had any other forms of questions. I'm done with the whole dictionary definitions. I really don't care about that part.
Okay. So
yeah, and I guess sorry for the snark, because apparently people aren't liking that, but I don't know how else to go forward here, because I've pointed out I've brought this forward a couple different times. You don't really have any sort of objective truth claims when operating within the assumption that political rule is legitimate. You just have preferences being put forward as if they're these sort of claims for how things should be, and you don't also have a rebuttal to something to what I put forward as an explanation of libertarianism, because I'm putting forward axioms and you're trying to use this utilitarian weird empiricist approach to my argument, and I don't really know how to go forward from here, because on top of that, the fact that you're not really giving me anything to work with, you've also kind of negated your own entire argument with some of the things that you've said earlier. I mean, I could point out the sort of problems with your claims about anarchy, that yes, we can point to things which exist, such as diseconomy of scale, which show that the sort of foundational premises for your assumptions of how things would go in an anarchy just straight up could not happen. And also that...
Well, I wouldn't say that it could not happen.
You've already said that your case for minarchy against anarchy just doesn't really exist, that it's not true, and that it's not foundationally sound. So I don't know what else to say, really.
That my case doesn't exist. I kind of thought I stated it earlier, but okay.
Well,
I'd also like to... Sorry, continue.
What were you going to say, Filthy? I was just going to say, well, I mean, you've said the entire case for minarchy is you need a quote unquote small government, which, by the way, I still haven't heard a response to my explanation of how that doesn't work on a conceptual basis to evaluate the ethics of a government based on the scale. But
okay, well,
what I was going to say is that God damn it, I lost my train of thought.
So anyways, the point that honestly, the kind of takeaway I'm getting from the case that you two are making is that libertarianism is consistent with a government because some governments are bigger or smaller than others.
No, not
No.
really. I mean, if a government gets so intrusive that it starts violating people's religious rights, or even start banning homosexual marriage or possession of any kinds of drugs, and that would
Or
be
freedom
one
of
that
speech, or freedom to defend themselves.
yeah, individual liberties like that.
So you would agree that a government that takes away people's property is not libertarian?
Yes, I don't believe in eminent domain.
All right. So you would also agree that a government that that prevents people from competing with it in terms of the services it provide is also going to be not libertarian?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want the government to have complete monopoly on some certain things. I mean, I don't see as to how some certain courts would be able to compete with other courts, but if that could theoretically be done, then whatever. But things like security, like private police versus public police, not against that, not against there being private firehouses or private roads or anything else like that. And I'm certainly not for nationalizing all healthcare to get us like an NHS style of single payer healthcare system or anything else like that.
Of course, of course. And you would also agree that a government that is compatible with libertarianism would not be engaging in creating rules that people are required to follow, even if they had no role in deciding on what those rules are.
Could you specify what you mean by what rules?
The legislation.
Like what kind of legislation would you be specifically talking about?
Like any legislation. Just a politician. Like a politician is just writing rules that others that had no consent or were never asked whether or not they want to follow these rules are still required to follow nonetheless.
Are we talking about rules like certain things in which? Are we talking about like?
What about laws regarding don't murder?
Laws in general?
I'm not going to call legislation law because that's a bastardization of what law is.
We're not talking about definitions. We're just.
Well,
I know, but anyway, I'm just stating.
Are we talking about
just like
crimes, or are we talking about crimes like murder and theft? Are we talking about all of them, or are we just talking about specifically victimless crimes?
Yeah.
Well, the problem though with calling it law is that it fundamentally, it essentially makes a truth claim without actually making an argument.
No, that's not what we're trying to do. Okay.
Yeah, that's not what we were not talking about that.
That aside, so.
Fair enough.
We're just talking about like the concept of legislation, which encompasses things like victim crimes and victimless crimes.
Well, that's exactly what I was about to go into. Because it's backed up through coercion, the legislative fiat is arbitrary, so
I'm
it's not. It
I'm
doesn't
trying to ask something.
Call it law. Okay.
So I was just asking about like whether or not they would consider legislation which encompasses things like victim and victimless crimes, if that is compatible with a libertarian government.
Victimless crimes, for the most part, I would say no, they are not compatible with a libertarian form of government.
And by extension, I would say that I would differentiate victimed and victimless crimes. Victimed crimes, that being the term that was said earlier.
Yes, of course. And I'm just curious, Rational Outlaw, what you said for the most part, victimless crimes are not crimes. I'm curious as to an example of a victimless crime that is a crime.
Well, for one of the examples, although this is something I don't think any form of anyone should have, is nuclear power. Or not nuclear power, I mean nuclear weapons. For example, I don't believe the government nor any singular group or person should have a nuclear weapon because, one, I don't think it is necessary for anyone to have, and two, I think it can do damage potentially, whether accidentally or on purpose, to the environment or to other people if it was accidentally released.
I want to say that I kind of slightly disagree with Rash on this. I mean, I'm kind of apathetic in regards of whether or not that nukes get decriminalized for the private citizen to own. I mean, if it was decriminalized, well, then very, very, very few people would be able to attain one because it'd be so damned expensive.
Yeah, I think so. But the point, anyways, sorry, so the point that I'm trying to get at is that given that we at least you, Darkon, agree that a libertarian government is not going to take people's property. Therefore, it's not going to tax.
Or it's
not going to. Correct. So it's not going to tax it. People can compete against it, and it doesn't legislate. Then that's not a government. That's anarchism. You're an anarchist.
And back to
No.
Well, back to the point is, I mean, doesn't really necessarily pertain to nukes themselves, but nukes would be a great example of exactly why, on practical grounds, there are arguments for against the state. I mean, even within how the state is conceptualized by minarchists. You yourself just said it. It's not desirable for the state or for anyone to have them for recreational use, at least in my opinion. I mean, there's nothing ethically inconsistent with it. But yeah, I don't think that it's desirable. But the thing is that they exist. So the best thing that we could do to counteract that would be to essentially have as many people working with them or that have access with them, one, for a form of sort of mutually assured destruction, but also so that the negative consequences of a nuke going off could be counteracted because there are more people approaching research with them and more methodologies going into this. Meanwhile, if all the nukes are owned by the state, well, not only is nobody really experimenting with them, and there's no improvements to the sort of potentially devastating effects they would have on the environment if one went off, but also, on the other problem that you have nothing but a bunch of people who are complete psychopaths with something that could literally destroy the world. And I don't think that's desirable. I'd say at the very least, anybody should be able to, in order to counteract the psychopaths, should be able to get their hands on something like that.
So did you have anything to say in regards of nukes?
I just did.
Oh, no, sorry. Did I say? So I meant to say rational outlaw. My bad.
My opinion would be that I don't think mutual assured destruction is a good enough reason, personally. I think that's a pretty poor argument in my personal view, because if we destroy everyone, there will be nothing. I don't see the reason why we should have that. Now, as for your point that there would be some crazy person that could have it, yes, I admit that there is the possibility of that. However, I think it's unlikely that they would have enough to do basically destroy the Earth like as we do right now. We have enough nukes to destroy the Earth 11 times over. And I don't think we have any necessity for that many nukes at all.
Can I make a point on the nukes question? I know this is off topic, but I just wanted to say something about it real quick.
Sure.
Yeah. So with nukes, it's not going to be different than any other form of property that others would consider dangerous. A lot of the points that you make about nukes, although are completely understandable, don't get me wrong, are the same thing that a lot of Democrats, liberals, and socialists say about guns. Ultimately, I think Darkon is absolutely correct when he says that, yeah, nukes are going to be ridiculously expensive. They're also going to be ridiculously expensive to maintain, and the facilities required to be able to house a nuke without, killing yourself with radiation poisoning are going to be ridiculously expensive. This creating enough of a barrier to deter the overwhelming majority of people who would otherwise want a nuke from getting one. I mean, speaking for myself, I don't want a nuke. I want a nuke silo. But that's a...
I think we all want a nuke silo.
Yes.
Especially one with a hot tub and stuff.
I would very much like that as well.
Hey, see, we can agree on something.
Yay. But yeah, my point is that a nuclear weapon is no different than any other form of property. And yes, there is danger. That's absolutely correct. But I think that there is enough of a cost in relation to the supply and demand that is going to prevent people who would otherwise be irresponsible with it. I mean, after all, if you're an idiot and irresponsible, there's a very high chance that you won't have the resources to be able to get one in the first place.
And hopefully anyone who does sell them won't sell them to an idiot.
Well, I mean, of course, especially since they won't sell them to an idiot who only has $30 to his name.
Although we also have to admit there are some idiots who are very rich.
That is true. I don't know why a rich idiot would want to nuke, though.
Who knows? Maybe strong arming. I don't know.
The only reason I can think of is that because they want to see a nuclear explosion for themselves, in which case I'm pretty sure that there are ways to accomplish this, like blow up some uninhabited island and sell tickets.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and interject here. Excellent job, guys, on not talking over one another, so thank you for keeping the discussion civil. At this point, I would put to any of the debaters, if you need to step away from the computer for a minute or two, go ahead and do so. And as soon as everybody's back, we are going to move into the questions from the viewers. Nate has been keeping track of questions. If you still would like to ask questions, you can keep posting them in the chat and see if Nate wants to put those out as to be asked. Just remember, please keep them on topic. Are any of the debaters in need of a break or ready to go right into the question?
I do, but I also want to add very quickly. Sorry, I will say that after bathroom breaks or whatever, that if we were going to have like another section of open dialogue, then I do have some other things to address at that point, or whatever.
We'll see if we have time. I'd like to keep this around 2 hours. We can go a little bit longer if we need to, but
all right.
I'm gonna just go ahead and get some coffee really quick.
Okay.
I'll still be here. I'm fine.
How long were you expecting the stream to go on? Because I mean,
be right back.
I think it's probably going to go close to 2 hours, if not 2 hours.
That sounds fine, I guess. I just wasn't expecting it to be this long.
Well,
I've enjoyed it so far, but and I don't have any issue with the length. But yeah, I was thinking it's going to be more like an hour. But all right.
So I guess just me and you, 2 cents.
All right, for the time being, I see that Nate has posted the first question that he's written down. I'll put it up on the screen here.
Which state has less? Oh, no, that's not the question. How do you limit a country through a long term? Is the U.S. a clear indication that it didn't work? I would say the U.S. did work is still working for the most part. The majority of the growth seems to have happened around in the early 1900s with the growth of the government. However, we still have predominantly most of the freedoms. Although the government is a whole lot bigger, yes, I agree, but I would say it has relatively worked. I don't consider the U.S. right now we're close to a minarchist government. However, I do think it has worked quite well.
I think we're in the point where the government is depriving people of property all because they're saying words on the internet. We're very close to the point where Great Britain is, where they'll just straight up arrest you for saying mean things to certain people on Twitter. And think they might already be doing this.
I do think there is the possibility of that happening. However, I still think it's very difficult to happen still in the U.S. I still think we're a bit ways away from Britain personally.
Also, I remember not too long ago, the government proposed and actually passed into legislation making it a criminal act to criticize the government. I don't know if you remember that.
Are we talking about the U.S. government or
the U.S. government?
I don't recall that. I'd have to see it.
Yeah, it was proposed in, I forget the year, but it was, I know it was 9 years after the Constitution was ratified. It was called the Alien and Sedition Acts.
Yes, that one was proposed, but I recall that it was never
It was passed into law. It was eventually overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court, but that should demonstrate very clearly that the kinds of limitations that you would hope to put into place aren't exactly going to be terribly effective in making sure that the government doesn't become tyrannical. To say nothing of the fact that the founding fathers were not only still alive but still in power.
Well, I would have to disagree with a bit on that because I think it actually shows that it worked, although it took a little bit of time.
Sorry, I'm back.
It showed that the Supreme Court was willing to take that law apart.
The fact that they were willing to is definitely a good thing. We can't dispute that. But the fact that that was even passed in the law in the first place indicates that, well, there was a tremendous failure from the very beginning. Hell, how the hell do they even have power in the first place to throw people in the cage because they say words that certain politicians don't like?
Okay, SO and Dark Khan, if you want to quick respond to the question on the screen.
Oh, never mind.
By the way, I did not know you could bring up questions like this.
How do you limit a country throughout the long term? Well, I think it's pretty clear that no, you can't. There are various sort of systemic reasons which will ensure that states can't be limited, as my opponents conceded to earlier in the debate. And yeah, I'd say that the US is probably the most clear example of this, but that also would assume that that was sort of the intention. I'd really recommend everybody to read some of the things written by George Washington, Ben Franklin, Hamilton, Adams, and the other people who've signed the Declaration of Independence. Read into some of the things they've said about finance and some of their connections to the Bank of England. Because what I mean, I've done a bit of research into that, and it seems like from the beginning, the American Revolution was bankrolled by the Bank of England, and the people who signed the Declaration of Independence were agents of the Rothschild banking dynasty. But even before that, something that was brought up earlier in this debate is the continuity between liberalism and libertarianism, and that's simply not true. Even in the conception of liberalism, it was never the aim of liberalism, and the premises which make up liberalism were never synonymous or even comparable to libertarianism.
Okay, I'm going to have to cut you off there. Dark Khan, if you have anything to respond, we need to get to the rest of the questions.
As far as Rothschilds and the and whatever whoever might have funded the founding fathers, I would say that on the surface of that, I don't really care unless somebody was to like actually point out the immoralities entailed by that certain conspiracy. But anyway, how do you limit a government? I would say that for the most part, and I think Nate mentioned the U.S. Asking, is that an example? I would say yes, to an extent it was. I mean, obviously there were like some invasions of freedom and so forth, like particularly when it came to Abe Lincoln arresting people for, you know, for criticizing the Civil War. I would say like up until about probably around the time that the Federal Reserve was made, but definitely by the time of FDR, we were, relatively speaking, fairly limited in our governance, despite whatever failings happened on down the road. And I would say subjectively, those issues have to be resolved.
All right, moving on to the next question coming from Choppa Cat. Do you differentiate between government governance from a state?
Do you differentiate government and governance from a state? Not necessarily. I mean, governance or government, well, the word governance, that has other context to it other than a, you know, an all-encompassing big daddy government ruling over a country like people like the... Anyway, I'm just going to leave it at that. There are other contexts of governance, but in this context, no, I would not differentiate government and governance from the state.
I think there is a fairly subtle difference. The differentiation I use is that a state encompasses the entirety of the society plus the government, whereas the government is very much the financial firm that engages in the monopoly and arbitration. Dark Khan, would you find this definition or this differentiation reasonable?
The government is the organization that runs the state, in other words?
Yes.
I mean, I guess essentially so. That's fair.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it also depends on the context. Like if we're going to talk about a firm governing its finances, if you're going to use the term in that context, then yeah, obviously that's different from a state, because it's not sort of an organization that the state is. It's just a firm managing itself. I mean, that's one way the term can be used. But in terms of how we're describing sort of the government or the state as sort of an external organization which attempts to centrally control society, no, I would not say there's a difference between government and the state, except for the sort of subtle difference that Filthy pointed out. Organizationally, it's the same.
Rational Outlaw, did you have anything to add?
I have no comment.
All right, moving on to the next question, which comes from JC Armitage. If the only state in the world was a minarchist utopia, wouldn't that make it the biggest state in the world? Food for thought.
Yes.
Exactly. That's exactly what I was pointing out.
Well, big as in the amount of land that it has jurisdiction over. Yes, in that context, yes.
Well,
but when we're talking about big government, we're talking primarily about what power it has in relation to the population that the government has jurisdiction over.
But that's not the point he's getting at. He's not talking about the geographical size of its boundary compared to other governments. It's that there are no other governments to compare it to. So by default, it is the government that represses people's freedom the most.
Okay,
yeah,
okay.
How can you make an ethical evaluation of a government if there are no other governments to compare it to?
If I could say, in a technical sense, yes, but in a realistic sense, since it would be unlikely for it to be there only one minarchist government and everywhere else is an anarchist society, no.
Well, considering that the UN exists.
Well, by extension of if the minarchist state was to exist, be the only state in the world that exists, it would be the biggest state in the world. Well, then, yeah, obviously, if you have just a 5-foot tall midget elephant and there are no 10-foot tall elephants at all, well, then, of course.
And that's also the thing, like, you're saying that it would be impractical. Well, that's kind of irrelevant, because if it were impractical for one government to exist, I agree with you.
What
that
is impractical?
The idea that there would only ever be one government in the world. I agree
well,
that
I did not say that, but okay.
that's... Well, no, what Rational Outlaw said is that would be impractical, so that's not really a scenario.
No, I'm not saying it would be impractical. I'm saying it's unrealistic that there would only be impractical governments that would form.
The point that I was getting at, though, is that since this is an ethical dilemma and we're talking about an axiom, it's kind of irrelevant how practical or how
it doesn't seem really an ethical question. It just seems more like a
would be for this to be the case. The fact is that there is an exception to the standard of evaluating governments by their scale, a very clear one. Therefore, the concept is invalid, because that's the thing with ethical arguments. As absolutes, if there is one contradiction, that means the whole thing falls apart.
Not exactly the point I was making, but okay. Can we go on to the next question?
Sure.
All right, moving on to the next question, which comes from the Servius.
Hey, Servius.
Why should our taxes pay for it to secure the... I think what he means is, why should our taxes pay to secure the people/nation?
The best way to articulate that, I would have to come up with a better answer in the future. Why should our taxes pay for it to secure the people or nation? Well, I would say that there is technically no should to that. What I say should not happen, though, is people murdering, raping, whatever else have you, completely stealing a person's house or business. That's what should not happen. And if there is to be a conventional state that exists that will tax people to okay, well, let me rewind myself a little bit. I say that there should not be any of those types of infringements on liberty, be it rape, stealing property, or murder, or so forth. And there should be no one getting away with it, I say. And if there is to be like a conventionally conceived state that taxes people to make courts and whatnot to preserve that kind of thing, to preserve rights, liberties, and due process, well, then I say it's not that big a deal. But like I said a little bit earlier in this debate, I would like to see some experimentation with taxation to make it not coercive, or at least not in the conventional state of coercive.
Well, the way you make taxation not coercive is you make the government not a government. You make it a private business.
This is kind of a thing that you said earlier as well, Filthy. You said that if I am for like some form of voluntary tax, quote unquote, to fund a court, then therefore I am an anarchist and not a minarchist. The thing that I would say that kind of differentiates me from at least a typical anarchist is that the private court would hold to accountable criminals and make sure that they don't get away with it, and put forth an investigation to make sure whether or not a person is innocent or not of committing a certain crime, whatever it may be.
Which I don't think is going to be controversial among anarchists either.
All right, I'm going to keep this moving for the sake of time. We got more questions to get to. Nate's question, sorry. Governments don't last as long as anarchies. Why set up a government in the first place?
I'll let you
I
go,
have to
since
disagree with that. I believe anarchies don't last even shorter. We can find governments in which they've lasted thousands of years. For example, the Chinese government, although it has gone through many different rulers, it's the longest continuous civilization in current history.
Well, you're conflating civilization with the state, and you yourself just said it. The regime has changed and split up into different governments and then reformed again multiple different times throughout those last 1,000 years. In fact, not a single one of them's lasted for more than 100 to 200 years.
The average age of a country is around 200 years of how long they last. I believe an anarchist government would not nearly last that long, at least.
Well, of course, an anarchistic government wouldn't last very long because it wouldn't exist.
Society. I meant an anarchist society, if I may clarify.
Yeah, slip of the tongue.
Well, let's see here. Cospaia lasted somewhere around 500 years. You had ancient Ireland, which lasted thousands of years.
How big were those, though? How big was the population?
Not relevant to the point, though. I mean,
I believe it is relevant to the point because
it's
the size of the amount of people, because the more people you have, the more differing views you have. The more differing views you have, the more fights you'll have.
To say nothing of the fact that governments are a fairly recent phenomenon in human history, appearing only in the last 50.
We actually have had them for a lot longer than what you probably believe, because we still have had also tribes. Those are
actually we know exactly how long governments have existed. It's about 5,500 years. The first documented government was the Empire of Samaria.
And what about tribes?
We've had intercontinental trade for. We had intercontinental oceanic trade for.
But we've also had tribes in which those had their own rules and laws. Those are also some forms of government, although it's very small.
They're not, though. There's no evidence to support that they had monopolies on arbitration.
A government is not rules. A government is a monopoly on arbitration. You can have rules in the absence of a government.
All right, I'm just going to point out Pumpkin Road. They inadvertently answered your question, which was which state has lasted longer than the Irish anarchy. So I think you've heard what both sides have to say about that. I believe the first super chat was, what are your positions on the nuking of Japan in World War II?
Should we answer that one?
I don't even know if I need to answer that.
Just answer the anarchy one again, just really quickly. I don't believe Ireland was an anarchist society. I believe at the most it was a minarchist society because of the tribes they had.
But there was competing arbitration, so it wasn't a state society.
Not in perhaps the modern sense, but it is a form of government.
It seemed to have like a whole bunch of miniature states with the chieftains and tribes.
You're just taking firms and then calling them states. That would be like calling Walmart a state to call these Tuatha states.
Basically, a government is a monopoly on arbitration, and in the absence of that monopoly, it's not a government.
I mean, doesn't the tribe have monopoly on arbitration with its few dozen tribesmen and it's like 1 acre of land or whatever small amount?
No, because it doesn't use coercion to suppress other arbiters or force people to associate with it.
The
fact of the matter is that
its own people to associate with itself. It keeps their tribe members from leaving.
Well, they were free to
punish
leave.
them with forcing them to leave, except for in those cases, I believe it punishes its people when they leave or betray the tribe.
People were free to leave at any time and associate with any Tuatha that they wished. Not to mention that they were free to get Brennans, who were the judges at the time, to adjudicate any disputes that they had in the tribe or between tribes, even if the Brennan in question had no association with either party. In fact, oftentimes this was more often than not the case because people were more interested in having an uninterested third party to dispute the case, so they are certain that the dispute was resolved fairly. The absence of a monopoly very clearly demonstrates that there was no government involved.
And let's clarify, because I just saw somebody say tribal societies did have wars. Well, we're not talking about tribal societies. We're talking about a specific society which had firms, and that was Ireland. And no, there was no coercive monopoly on force there.
And should we go into the question of nuking Japan?
What is your position on nuking Japan? I believe it was a necessary evil.
I mean, as far as I'm concerned for right now anyways, I think it was necessary for the context and time of things. And obviously, if there were alternatives, it would have been a whole lot more preferable. But anyways.
Well, there were alternatives, actually. The fact of the matter is, Japan was suing for peace around April or May, if I recall correctly. They were going through Switzerland, who were, of course, neutral in the war as an intermediary, in an attempt to get in contact with the U.S., and Japan's terms of surrender were actually incredibly reasonable. They were willing to surrender completely unconditionally, except that they wanted to keep their emperor. And the United States thought that this was unacceptable, and so they were trying to push for an unconditional surrender. This ended up resulting in the war continuing for a lot longer than was strictly necessary, and eventually culminated in the nuking of Japan. Of Hiroshima was the first one, if I recall correctly.
Could you please send us the link for this so I could look at it later?
And
yeah, sure.
Also,
okay, you guys are gonna have to, as far as the sources, we'll have to work that off offline. I'm gonna allow this one final question, and then we're gonna go into closing statements.
Okay.
For everyone else's, I'm sorry we didn't get your questions, but we only have a limited amount of time. So Night Shift 10,000 asks, to the positive side, if you don't want universal health care for everyone, why are you in support of universal security that has the ability to strip people of their rights?
Are we talking about cops and police forces, or are we talking?
I presume that public police, law enforcement agencies would be who he's talking about. But Night Shift, if you wish to clarify, put another comment up.
Well, like I said kind of earlier, I am not for complete nationalization of every single industry, and this would kind of include security as well. I guess I would have to further clarify on what I think would kind of be ideal with security. Like, there are a whole bunch of private security groups that say, let's say, mayors and city council of multiple different cities can hire out and contract those certain private police forces for as far as enforcement of the law and making sure that nobody murders and that other kind of stuff. And if they find them to be faulty, well, then they contract out to, say, another private security force. just kind of like in the same way that cities contract out construction companies. I guess that would be where I start off with in regards of that.
Well, I guess my reasoning against a universal healthcare system is because, one, it'd be the worst thing. That's probably one of the things that the government is the worst at. And two, is that it's a continually growing cost. The costs are continually growing within a universal healthcare system. So it doesn't matter. The only way you could sustain it is by having a continually growing workforce. But either way, I still don't think it's worth it because of the immense costs and the immense inefficiency compared to even other forms of state control of other forms of things like the police force or military. It's perhaps the most inefficient form of government, or sector of government, I should say.
I mean, you could say literally the exact same thing about any other state service, but okay.
All right, at this point, we're approaching the 2-hour mark, so I'm going to give each side the opportunity for a closing statement. I'm not going to run the clock, but I ask that you try to keep it concise. I will cut you off if I think it's starting to run longer. So, Filthy Heretic, Esoteric, please mute your mics, and Dark Khan, Rational Outlaw, you have, I'd say, 2 to 4 minutes. Make your closing statement regarding the debate.
Yeah, I guess to kind of clarify, in regards to the whole definition thing, my whole point is that I don't find anarchism or libertarianism to be completely synonymous with each other. As not mean to strawman, it almost seems logically what Eso was kind of implying with the whole definition thing, logically implying with the whole definition argument here. And man, there was something else I wanted to address about that, but I can't remember. And as far as taxation goes, like I said, I find it morally ideal if there was not to be some coercive tax system. But on the other hand, I don't find it to be overall immoral, or at least objectively speaking anyways. And I would point out the U.S. as being a kind of an example. Well, actually, I guess I already pointed it out of being an example of Minarchism back in its early days, anyways, at least. And the conception of scale, I kind of wish that we gone like addressing this part during this whole discussion a little bit more. But I would say that as far as measuring how authoritarian or libertarian a society is, and how hands-off that the state or the government is with that country, it is not arbitrary. I mean, leaving people to their religious liberties, their drug liberties, their sex liberties, their gun liberties, their private property liberties, all that kind of stuff, that's not arbitrary, I would say. And if really measuring up and comparing countries' liberty to each other is arbitrary, well, then that would mean that the economic freedom scale is absolutely arbitrary in of itself. But we still kind of use that. And I think it's fair to use the economic freedom index.
Okay, Rational Outlaw, you have anything to say?
Yeah. I would like to say I still believe that Minarchism is the best way that we have in keeping as much liberty as possible for as long as time as possible. I do not believe the what was it, the Ireland or Irish? I forget. What was it?
Ancient Ireland.
Yes, ancient Ireland. I don't think those were necessarily anarchist societies. As I said, those were tribal societies, a kind of form of government. Although be it more simplistic form of government, I do believe those were a form of government. And at the most, those were basically minarchist forms of government. Just they were very small societies. My whole point is that I believe minarchism in and of it today is the best way we have of keeping the most liberties for as long as possible.
All right, thank you very much. Dark Khan, Rational Outlaw, please mute your mics. Filthy Eso, you may unmute your mics, and you have several minutes to make your closing statement.
Okay, well, I only really had two things to say. It was one thing before Dark Khan mentioned the scale argument. Well, sure, economically there's a difference between the expanse certain governments operate around, but that doesn't explain why they expand, and it also doesn't create an ethical argument. And I'm thoroughly disappointed, I think, in this debate overall, because I was expecting to go more into sort of the arguments for minarchy, but it was like within 20 to 30 minutes into the debate, I mean, they had already conceded that their point, their arguments for minarchy just aren't actually tangible, and there's nothing really to base them on. So most of the time we were just making flawed arguments against anarchy. But something that I was going to say is, if the only thing that can really be said at this point is that they think we're debating whether or not a minarchy is more sustainable or in the long term is more tangible than an anarchy. Well, the thing is, at this point, because of things like cryptocurrency or serverless connections, and because production and trade seems to be trending ever more towards entrepreneurship and peer-to-peer associations, with things like micro CNC machines or 3D printers, it seems like not only is that not the case, but it seems pretty soon that by pretty soon, I mean the next time that we have another global depression, statism will not be sustainable, because the means by which a state sustains itself, the ability to consistently collect revenue through coercive taxation, will not be reliable. So it seems not only is that not true, but it seems the opposite is true. At this point, anarchy is an inevitability. And at this point, I think a more helpful discussion going forward, at least personally, would be, how do we ensure the most peaceful transition between a state society and an anarchy? And how exactly do we go about setting up sort of ensuring that there isn't that much chaos?
So the point I just want to make is that the state is evil. There is no ifs, ands, or buts about it. The state is an unequivocal, unrepentant injurer to liberty, and ultimately humanity will be significantly better off for it. The idea that you can tweak to pick and choose what results from a government seizing power is not only incredibly conceited, but also not clear or even accurate to what we can observe in reality. This is ultimately the problem with the minarchist argument, that it's ultimately just a set of preferences for what you want a coercive monopoly to point a gun at people to ultimately accomplish. In this sense, and appealing to definitions used by philosophers both old and new as to the definition of libertarianism, it is blatantly obvious that any libertarian society or libertarian cannot possibly have a state and be consistent in the principles of libertarianism. The only argument I have heard that contests this is either an appeal to authority, to the definition of, or to the dictionary definition, or alternatively a pragmatic argument that really has nothing to do with principles or definitions. So with this in mind, yeah, the libertarianism and a libertarian society cannot have a state. The only way going forward is anarchy.
Thank you for bringing that up. Oh, sorry, but can I just say, yeah, I was going to address that in my introduction, but I got cut off because I ran out of time. But yeah, there cannot be a cohesive, principled argument for political rule, specifically because there's nothing which necessarily defines political rule other than just the use of force, which is arbitrary. But yes, thank you for explaining that, Filthy.
All right. I'd like to thank everybody who watched. Thank you to Darkon, Rational Outlaw, Filthy, and Eso for being willing to have this debate and do so in a civil manner. It's certainly better than a lot of debates I've seen on YouTube. It was fun for me to get to host it and do the moderation, so thank you for asking me to be your moderator. And for all those interested, I know all of us have videos on our channels that discuss these topics in detail, and I'm sure we're more than willing to take questions on Discord, comment section, or anywhere else. So everybody have a good night, and as always, that is my 2 cents. Take it for what it's worth.
Bye.
And have a Merry Christmas, everybody. And a Happy New Year.
Yeah. I'm screenshotting that. I'm so screenshotting that.